Jared, you called me the ghost in the guest house. You said my old school consulting was a relic of a dead century. You handed me an eviction notice over sourdough toast because you needed a content studio for your failing startup. But here's the thing about ghosts, Jared. We don't just haunt houses, we haunt ledgers. And I'm about to show you that the man you just kicked out of his home is the same man who owns your entire future. Welcome back to Payback Logs. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. You're gonna love it here. In the world of high-stakes venture capital, there's a term we use for people like my son-in-law, Vaporware. Vaporware is a product that is advertised, hyped, and sold to investors, but it doesn't actually exist. It's a beautiful shell with nothing inside. Jared was the human embodiment of Vaporware. He wore $700 sneakers, spoke in a word salad of synergy and AI disruption, and carried himself with the unearned confidence of a man who had never actually built a thing in his life. I, on the other hand, am Silas Vane. I'm 68 years old. I spent 40 years as a turnaround consultant. That's a polite way of saying I'm the person a bank calls when a company's bleeding out. I go in, I find the rot, and I cut it out with a scalpel. I'm not loud. I don't wear branded hoodies. I wear well-tailored wool, and I keep my mouth shut. Because in my business, the person who speaks the least usually holds the most debt. It was a bright Sunday morning in the Berkeley Hills. I was sitting on the patio of the main house, a house I had bought in cash in 1994, watching my daughter, Sarah, pour coffee. Sarah was the light of my life, but she had one fatal flaw. She believed in the potential of broken men. Jared sat across from me, tapping furiously on his iPhone 15 Pro Max. He hadn't looked at his breakfast. He was too busy hustling. "Silas," Jared said, finally putting the phone down. He didn't look at me. He looked at the view of the Golden Gate Bridge in the distance. "We need to have a pivotal conversation about the guest house." I sipped my tea. I had built that guest house with my own hands 10 years ago. It was a craftsman-style studio tucked into the redwoods at the back of the property. It was where I kept my archives, my drafting table, and my peace of mind. "The guest house is fine, Jared. The roof needs a bit of moss scraping, but otherwise it's structurally sound." "That's the thing," Jared said, leaning forward. His eyes were bright with that dangerous Silicon Valley fever. "Structure isn't enough anymore. Vanguard Nexa, my startup, is scaling. We just landed a massive partnership opportunity with Aegis Holdings. We're moving into the content generation phase. We need a dedicated studio for our Thought Leader podcasts and AI streaming. The guest house is the perfect vibe hub." I looked at Sarah. She was looking at her plate, her fingers twisting her napkin. She knew what was coming. "And?" I asked. Jared reached into his leather messenger bag and pulled out a manila envelope. He slid it across the table. I didn't need to open it to know what it was. I could smell the fresh ink of a printer press. "It's a formal notice to vacate, Silas," Jared said, his voice dropping into a rehearsed, empathetic CEO tone. "Look, we love having you here, but the guest-as-a-service model isn't working for the business. You're retired. You don't need 80 acres and a studio. We've looked into some really high-end senior living communities in Walnut Creek. They have bridge clubs, Silas. You'd love it." I looked at the envelope. "Jared, I own this property. I let you and Sarah move into the main house 5 years ago when your 3 first companies went bankrupt. I pay the property taxes. I pay the gardeners." Jared chuckled, a sharp, condescending sound. "Actually, Silas, check the filings. When Sarah and I got married, you put the deed into a family trust, a trust that I am now the managing executor of, thanks to that paperwork you signed during your shaky spell after the hip surgery last year. Legally, the business has the right to reclaim underutilized assets for growth." He leaned back, crossing his arms. He thought he had trapped a confused lion in a cage of his own making. "You've got 30 days, Jared said.
I've already hired the contractors to gut your archives. Most of those old paper files are going to the shredder. We're going paperless, Silas. Welcome to the future." I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I took the envelope and walked toward the redwoods. 30 days, I repeated. "Don't take it personally," Jared called out as I walked toward the redwoods. "It's just business. Disruption is painful, but it's necessary for the next vision." I walked back to my studio. I closed the heavy oak door and sat at my desk. I looked at the filing cabinets Jared wanted to shred. They didn't contain junk. They contained the blueprints for every corporate takeover I executed since the 80s. I pulled a hidden laptop from the bottom drawer. It wasn't a sleek MacBook. It was a ruggedized, encrypted ThinkPad. I logged into a portal that required 3-factor authentication. The screen flickered to life, displaying the black and gold logo of Aegis Holdings. Jared had mentioned a partnership with Aegis. He thought Aegis was just a massive, faceless VC firm in New York. He didn't realize that Aegis was my firm. I had founded it. I was the chairman of the board. I had retired from the day-to-day operations, but I still held the golden share. I typed Jared's company name into the internal search bar. Vanguard Nexa. A red flag immediately popped up. Vanguard Nexa had applied for a $5 million Series A credit line. To secure the loan, the CEO, Jared, had listed a senior technical advisor with 40 years of experience to give the company gravitas. I clicked on the advisor's bio. There was my name, Silas Vane. Jared hadn't just evicted me. He had been using my reputation, my forged signature, and my life's work as collateral to get a loan from my own company. He was using my ghost to borrow money to kick me out of my own house. I leaned back in my chair, the green light of the screen reflecting in my glasses. "You're right about one thing, Jared. Disruption is painful, but you're about to find out that I'm the one who invented the hammer." I checked the due diligence status of his loan. It was set to close in 14 days. I hit a single key, an internal command known as a full forensic audit trigger. "Type justice in the comments," I murmured, a habit of a man who knew he was about to balance a very crooked set of books. Because in the world of high finance, you never, ever evict the man who owns your debt.
For the next 72 hours, I played the part of the broken relic. I moved through the main house with a practiced infirmity, letting my shoulders hunch and my footsteps drag on the hardwood. I wanted Jared to see exactly what he expected to see, a man whose foundation had finally cracked. Jared loved it. Every time I fumbled with the TV remote or asked a question I already knew the answer to, his chest would puff out another inch. He wasn't just a CEO anymore. In his mind, he was a conqueror. "Silas, Silas," he sighed on Tuesday evening, leaning against the kitchen island while sipping a $20 artisanal green juice. "You've got to stop living in the analog world. I saw you looking at those old ledger books again. Paper is just dead trees and dead ideas. My AI, Nexacore, could summarize your entire 40-year career in 3 seconds and tell you exactly where you went wrong." I looked up from my tea, my eyes purposely unfocused. "It's a lot of history in those books, Jared. Contracts, names, people who owe me favors." Jared laughed, a sharp, metallic sound. "In 2026, favors don't pay the bills. Scalability does. I'm closing the Series A with Aegis Holdings next Friday. $5 million, Silas. That's more than you made in your first 20 years of consulting, isn't it?" I didn't answer. I didn't tell him that I had made my first $5 million before he was out of diapers, and I'd done it without a Series A or a branding consultant. "I'm actually heading to the guest house now," Jared said, checking his Apple Watch Ultra. The contractors are coming tomorrow to haul out your filing cabinets. I've rented a heavy-duty industrial shredder. We're doing a cleansing ceremony. It's a startup culture thing. Out with the old, in with the Nexa." He walked out, whistling a tune that sounded as hollow as his business plan. I waited until I heard his Porsche 911 roar down the driveway. Then I stood up. The infirmity vanished. My spine straightened. I walked into the study and pulled up the real-time feed from the GhostNet, a secondary, hidden Wi-Fi network I'd installed in the guest house years ago. I didn't look at his Nexacore code. I looked at his personal liability ledger. Jared thought he was a genius because he was bootstrapping his company, but the data told a different story. To maintain the illusion of a Series A-ready firm, Jared had been bleeding Sarah dry. I found a secret credit line, a bridge loan from a high-interest private lender that was secured against the title of this very house. Jared hadn't just used my name for the Aegis loan. He had used Sarah's signature to gamble the roof over her head. He owed $2 million to a group called Black Oak Capital, and the interest was compounding daily. If the Aegis funding didn't hit by next Friday, Black Oak would trigger a foreclosure. Jared wasn't evicting me to build a studio. He was evicting me because he needed to sell the guest house and the 10 acres it sat on just to cover the interest payment for the month. He was a man standing on a trapdoor, and he was trying to convince me he was flying. I switched screens to the Aegis internal portal. My lead auditor, a woman named Elena, who I'd trained personally, had left a priority note on the Vanguard Nexa file. "Chairman Vane, we flagged the technical advisor's signature on the Nexa application. The ink density scan doesn't match your historical biometric profile. It looks like a high-end digital forgery. Shall we notify the authorities?" I typed a one-word reply: wait. I wanted Jared to feel the weight of the pen in his hand on Friday. I wanted him to see the Series A documents laid out on the table in the guest house. I wanted him to believe for a glorious second that he had won. Because in a turnaround, the most effective way to eliminate the rot is to let it expose itself completely before you cut. I walked to the window and watched the lights flicker in the guest house through the redwood trees. Jared was in there right now, probably tossing my old project files into a pile for the shredder. He thought he was destroying my past. He didn't realize he was shredding his only life raft. "Sarah," I whispered, as I saw my daughter walk across the lawn, looking tired and small. "I'm sorry you married a ghost, but I'm going to make sure that when he vanishes, he doesn't take you with him." I hit the confirm button on a secondary command: acquire Black Oak debt. By tomorrow morning, Aegis Holdings wouldn't just be Jared's potential investor. We would be his primary debt holder. I was buying his trapdoor, and I was the one holding the lever. "Type justice in the comments," I murmured, the clinical coldness of the auditor returning to my voice. Because the only thing more dangerous than a man with nothing to lose is a man who thinks he's already won.
The redwoods at night have a way of swallowing sound, making the world feel as small as a counting house. I sat in the darkness of the main house's library, the only light coming from the amber glow of a 20-year-old glass of scotch and the scrolling green text on my monitor. I wasn't just looking at Jared's debt. I was looking at my own reflection in the glass. I founded Aegis Holdings in 1988 with nothing but a used fax machine and a talent for seeing the leaks in other men's dreams. I chose the name Aegis because it means protection. My job for 40 years was to protect the capital, the employees, and the foundations of industry from the catastrophic ego of visionary CEOs who spent more on their office furniture than their R&D. I had retired 5 years ago to this house, the house I'd built for Sarah's mother before the cancer took her. I wanted to be Grandpa Silas. I wanted to prune the roses and tinker with my archives in the guest house. I wanted to believe that the world of predators and prey was behind me, but the predator had moved into my guest room. A soft knock on the library door broke my reverie. It was Sarah. She looked frayed, the skin under her eyes bruised with a fatigue that sleep couldn't fix. "Dad, you're still up?" she whispered, sitting in the leather wingback chair across from me. "I saw Jared. He was in the guest house throwing your old blueprints into a bin. He says it's clutter. I told him to stop, but he gets this look in his eye, Dad, like I'm an obstacle to his greatness." I set the scotch down. "Sarah, sit with me. We need to talk about the greatness Jared is building." "He's stressed about the Aegis funding, Dad. He says if this Series A doesn't close on Friday, the disruptive potential of Nexa will be lost. He's already spent the first $1 million in his head." "He's spent more than that, Sarah," I said, turning the monitor toward her. I didn't show her the Aegis files yet. I showed her the Black Oak Capital ledger. I showed her the second mortgage on this house. I showed her the signature at the bottom of the £2 million liability. She leaned in, her breath hitching. That's my signature, but I never signed a second mortgage. I signed a business insurance rider for the office lease. He told me it was a formality." "It's called signature harvesting, Sarah," I said, my voice dropping into the clinical tone of an auditor. He placed a high-interest debt instrument under a stack of mundane paperwork. He didn't just borrow money, he gambled your inheritance on a Vaporware AI that doesn't even have a functional API yet. Sarah's hand went to her mouth. The realization hit her like a physical weight. "We're going to lose the house, aren't we? If he doesn't get the Aegis funding, we're homeless." I reached out and took her hand. It was cold. "In a turnaround, Sarah, the first thing we do is stabilize the patient. You aren't going to lose the house, because an hour ago, Aegis Holdings purchased the Black Oak debt in a distressed asset sale. I am no longer just your father, Sarah. I am Jared's primary creditor." She looked at me, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and a sudden terrifying hope. You own the mortgage? You own the startup's debt?" "I own everything Jared thinks he's built," I said, "and on Friday I am going to call the debt due. But I need you to do something for me. I need you to play the supportive wife for 3 more days. Let him believe the Aegis board is impressed. Let him believe he's about to be a millionaire." "Why, Dad? Why not just stop him now?" "Because in business, you don't just stop a fire," I said, looking toward the guest house where the industrial shredder was letting out a muffled, rhythmic growl. "You let it burn the trash until the foundation is clean. Jared needs to stand in front of the people he's lied to and realize that the ghost he evicted is the one holding the match." I stood up and walked to the window. Jared was stepping out of the guest house, wiping dust from his expensive hoodie. He looked triumphant. He thought he had successfully erased 40 years of my history. He didn't know that my history was currently buying his future at 10 cents on the dollar. "Go to bed, Sarah," I said. "And remember, an Aegis isn't just a shield. In the right hands, it's a hammer." I checked my ThinkPad one last time before the sun came up. Message from Elena, Aegis lead auditor. "Chairman, the forensic buyback of Vanguard Nexa's liabilities is complete. You now control 100% of the company's debt and 49% of the equity through the default clauses Jared signed. We are ready for the Friday closing." "Type justice in the comments," I whispered to the empty library, because when a man tries to shred the past, he usually ends up shredding his own safety net.
To catch a thief, you don't stand in the light. You become part of the architecture.
On Wednesday, while Jared was at a founder's power lunch in Palo Alto, likely spending the last of Sarah's savings on a bottle of vintage Cristal, I took a ride. Not in my truck, but in an unmarked town car driven by one of my Aegis security leads. Jared's office wasn't in a skyscraper. It was a co-working loft in Soma, filled with exposed brick, beanbag chairs, and neon signs that said things like, "Move fast and break things." I didn't need a key. I owned the building's management company. I walked in at 2 p.m. wearing a maintenance jumpsuit and carrying a toolbox. To the 20-somethings typing away on their laptops, I was just another old guy fixing a leak. They didn't even look up. That's the tragedy of the disruptor mindset. They're so focused on the horizon, they never see the ground shifting beneath them. I reached Jared's private glass cubicle. It was littered with best CEO trophies he'd bought for himself and a whiteboard covered in incomprehensible flowcharts. I opened his desk drawer. I didn't find a revolutionary AI. I found a stack of synthetic revenue contracts. Jared wasn't just cooking the books, he was running a restaurant. He had created 12 fake LLCs, all registered to a P.O. box in Delaware, and was paying his own company for services that didn't exist. He'd take $50,000 of the Black Oak loan, cycle it through a shell company, and record it as monthly recurring revenue, or MRR, for Vanguard Nexa. To an outside investor, it looked like explosive growth. To a turnaround consultant, it looked like a suicide note. But then I found the final blow. Tucked inside a folder labeled Project Phoenix was a plan to acquire a small medical data startup. Jared was planning to use the $5 million from Aegis to buy this company, strip their legitimate patient data, and feed it into his Nexa core to make it look functional before the first board meeting. It wasn't just fraud anymore. It was identity theft on a massive scale. I sat in his ergonomic CEO chair and pulled a small USB drive from my pocket. I plugged it into his main terminal. In 3 minutes, the Aegis crawler had mirrored his entire hard drive. I walked out of the loft, the leak officially fixed. When I got back to the Berkeley Hills, the industrial shredder was still humming in the guest house. Jared was standing by the bin, tossing my 1992 Petro Global files into the teeth of the machine. He saw me and smirked. "Hard to watch, isn't it, Silas?" he shouted over the roar of the blades. 40 years of your life turning into confetti. But hey, look on the bright side. At least now you won't have to pack it when the movers show up on Monday." I stood there, my hands in my pockets, watching the paper turn to dust. "You're right, Jared. It is a cleansing ceremony. I can feel the air getting clearer already." "That's the spirit," Jared laughed, slapping me on the shoulder. "Tomorrow's the big day. Aegis is sending a senior board member to sign the papers right here in the guest house. I told them I wanted the legacy vibe for the press release. You should stick around. You might learn how a real deal is closed." I wouldn't miss it for the world. I went into the main house and found Sarah in the kitchen. She looked at me, her eyes asking the question she was too afraid to voice. "It's worse than we thought, Sarah. He's not just a failure, he's a criminal. But tomorrow, the debt comes due. I need you to be ready. When the meeting starts, I want you to sit in the back. Don't say a word. Just watch the vapor vanish." I went to my study and opened the Aegis portal. Instruction to board. The Vanguard Nexa closing will proceed as scheduled. However, the signing officer will be the chairman. Prepare the notice of default and the immediate seizure of assets documents. We are executing a hard reset. I leaned back and looked at the clock. 24 hours. "Type justice in the comments," I whispered, the weight of the Aegis finally settling onto my shoulders. Because the most dangerous thing you can do to an auditor is give him a reason to look at your books.
Thursday night was the kind of quiet that feels like a held breath. The industrial shredder in the guest house had finally stopped its hungry growl, leaving the redwood grove in a deafening silence. I found Sarah in the kitchen, staring at a stack of foreclosure warnings I'd intercepted from the mailbox. "He told me these were just clerical errors from the bank, Dad," she said, her voice trembling as she traced the red ink on the header. "He said the Aegis money would wash everything clean. He made it sound like a baptism, like once the check cleared, we'd be the perfect family again." I sat across from her and opened my ruggedized laptop. "Sarah, I need you to look at the Nexacore revenue logs. This isn't just a business failure. This is a crime scene." I showed her the synthetic revenue map. I showed her how Jared had been using her grandmother's inheritance, the money meant for her future, to fund a carousel of fake transactions. He wasn't building a company. He was building a hall of mirrors, and he was using her as the glass. "He didn't just gamble the house, Sarah," I said, my voice low and steady. "He used your identity to create ghost clients. If this Series A closes tomorrow and the SEC performs a standard audit, you are the one whose name is on the fraudulent contracts. He set you up to be his fall girl if the vapor vanishes." Sarah didn't cry, not this time. Something in her eyes shifted, the Vane iron finally forging under the heat of the betrayal. She looked at the guest house, where Jared was currently celebrating with a bottle of expensive bourbon, oblivious to the fact that his Series A was actually a Category 5 hurricane. "He's not just taking my house," she whispered. "He's taking my name. He's taking the only thing I have left of Mom." "Not if we execute the hard reset," I said. "Tomorrow, the Aegis board will arrive. Jared expects a signing ceremony. Instead, he's getting a liquidation event. I need you to stand in the back of that room, Sarah. I need you to witness the moment the debt is called. Because once the dust settles, you aren't just going to be the wife. You're going to be the receiver in bankruptcy." "What does that mean, Dad?" "It means you'll have the legal power to claw back every cent he spent on those Porsches and club memberships. It means the guest house stays, the main house stays, and Jared goes to the only place where disruption is a mandatory part of the schedule." She nodded. She reached out and closed the laptop, her grip firm. "Do it, Dad. Break the mirrors." I walked to the window. I could see Jared through the glass of the guest house. He was practicing his founder's speech in front of a mirror, adjusting his black turtleneck, looking every bit the visionary. He thought he was about to sign a document that would make him a king. He didn't realize he was about to sign a confession. I sent the final execute command to the Aegis legal team. "Tomorrow at 10 a.m., bring the surrender of assets forms and call the FBI's white-collar crime division. Tell them we have a synthetic revenue lead that's ready for a warm handoff." "Type justice in the comments," I murmured, watching the light in the guest house finally go dark. Because the only thing more expensive than an honest mistake is a calculated lie.
Friday morning arrived with a thick, low-hanging fog that crawled through the redwoods, obscuring the guest house until it looked like a phantom limb of the main property. I spent the early hours in the kitchen, nursing a black coffee and watching the digital feed. Jared was already in the guest house. He had spent the morning setting the stage. He'd brought in a high-end catering spread, smoked salmon, miniature quiches, and a bottle of vintage Krug. He had cleared the last of my analog filing cabinets into the driveway, where they sat like tombstones in the damp air. He was wearing his signature collection black turtleneck and a pair of glasses he didn't actually need, his visionary costume. "Silas, you're up," Jared shouted as I walked across the lawn at 9 a.m. He was buzzing with a manic, caffeine-fueled energy. "Big day, old man. The Aegis black cars will be here in an hour. I've set up the signing table in the center of the studio. It's poetic, right? Kicking out the past to sign the future in the exact same spot." I looked at the empty space where my drafting table used to be. "Poetic isn't the word I'd use, Jared." Don't be a sour grapes," he laughed, checking his watch. "The Aegis board is bringing the closing binder.
$5 million, Silas. Think about that. While you were counting pennies and filing paper, I built an empire out of thin air. Thin air is exactly what empires are usually made of right before they collapse, Jared. Whatever, just stay in the back, okay? I don't want your energy spooking the VCs. Sarah, get in here. Sarah walked into the guest house. She was wearing a sharp charcoal suit I'd bought her years ago for her first board meeting. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like an auditor's daughter. She took her seat in the corner, her face a mask of cold professionalism. At exactly 10 o'clock a.m., 3 black Cadillac Escalades pulled into the gravel driveway. Jared straightened his turtleneck and checked his reflection in a blank monitor. Here we go, the Aegis Sharks. Watch a master at work, Silas. 6 people stepped out of the cars. They weren't wearing hoodies. They were wearing the Aegis uniform. Dark suits, neutral expressions, and carrying leather briefcases that looked heavy enough to sink a ship. Leading them was Elena, my head of due diligence. She looked at me for a microsecond, a silent confirmation passing between us before turning her focus to Jared. Mr. Vance, I am Elena Vance, no relation. I am the managing director for Aegis Holdings. We are here for the Vanguard Nexa liquidation event. Jared froze, his hand extended for a handshake that Elena ignored. Liquidation? No, I think there's a typo in your notes, Elena. Today is the Series A closing, the $5 million funding round. Elena walked to the center of the room, the spot where my filing cabinets used to sit, and opened her briefcase. She laid out a single, thick binder bound in black leather. Mr. Vance, we performed a 72-hour deep dive audit into your Nexa core architecture and your synthetic revenue streams. We found 12 Delaware LLCs that exist only to launder your debt into reported income. We also found the forged technical advisor signature of Mr. Silas Vane on your loan application. Jared's face went from an arrogant tan to a sickly translucent gray. He looked at me, then at the board, then at Sarah. That's a misunderstanding. Every startup has growth adjustments. It's industry standard. Fraud is not an industry standard, Mr. Vance, Elena continued. Furthermore, as of 8 a.m. yesterday, Aegis Holdings is the primary holder of your debt from Black Oak Capital. You are currently in technical default on $2 million of high-interest loans secured by this property. Jared backed away, bumping into the table he'd set for the signing. The bottle of Krug rattled. I can explain. The AI is real. It just needs the capital to scale. The AI is a wrapper for a basic chatbot script, Jared, I said, finally stepping out from the shadows of the redwood beams. I walked to the table and picked up the binder. And your capital isn't coming. Jared stared at me, his mouth hanging open. Silas, what are you talking about? You're just a consultant. You're retired. I reached into the binder and pulled out a gold-embossed card and laid it on top of his Nexacore pitch deck. Silas Vane, chairman of the board, Aegis Holdings. The silence that followed was absolute. You could hear the fog dripping off the redwood needles outside. You're Aegis? Jared whispered, his legs finally giving out. He slumped into his executive chair. You've been watching me the whole time? I wasn't watching you, Jared. I was auditing you, and your balance sheet is a suicide note. Elena stepped forward and laid a second document on the table. Mr. Vance, this is a surrender of assets agreement. You will sign over 100% of your equity in Vanguard Nexa to your wife, Sarah Vane, as restitution for the fraudulent debt you placed in her name. If you sign, we will assume the Black Oak debt and clear the title of this house. And if I don't, Jared hissed, a spark of cornered animal rage in his eyes. I looked toward the driveway where a fourth car, unmarked and white, had just pulled in. 2 men in wind brackets with FBI on the back stepped out. Then we let the disruption continue in a federal courtroom, I said. The choice is yours, Jared. But remember, in this house,
I'm the one who decides when the lease is up. Type justice in the comments, I murmured, the open loop beginning to tighten. Because when a man builds a house out of mirrors, he shouldn't be surprised when the truth shatters them all. The air in the guest house was thick with the scent of expensive catering and cheap desperation. Jared sat in his ergonomic chair, but he looked like a child trapped in a giant seat. His visionary glasses were fogged, and his black turtleneck, the one he thought made him look like Steve Jobs, now just looked like a funeral shroud. "Silas," Jared whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. You're Aegis? All this time I was trying to impress the board, and the board was sitting in my backyard eating my sourdough?" "I wasn't eating your bread, Jared," I said, my voice dropping into the cold, rhythmic tone of a firing squad. "I was watching you starve the woman I love. I was watching you treat my life's work like clutter while you built a monument to your own ego out of thin air." Elena stepped forward, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor, the floor I had laid myself, plank by plank. She opened the black binder to the Forensic Evidence tab. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice a clinical blade, "let's discuss the Nexacore proprietary algorithm. Our technical team performed a source code audit at 3 a.m. Your revolutionary AI is actually a series of nested if-then statements hooked into a free open-source API. It has no predictive capability. It has no machine learning. It is, by definition, a fraudulent product." "It's a beta!" Jared shouted, standing up so fast his chair rolled back and hit the wall. "Every startup fakes it until they make it. That's the culture. You don't understand the speed of innovation." "I understand the speed of a free fall, Jared," I said, walking to the signing table. I picked up a single sheet of paper, the forged loan application. "And I understand the physics of forgery. You used a high-resolution digital trace of my signature from a 2024 tax document. You even matched the ink density, but you forgot one thing." I pointed to the tail of the S in my name. "I'm a structural engineer by trade, Jared. Every signature I've ever put on a legal document since 1982 has a microscopic delta symbol hidden in the ink flow. It's my personal proof of work. This signature on your $5 million loan, it's perfect, which is exactly how I knew it was a fake." Jared looked at the paper, then at the two FBI agents standing by the door. One of them, a man with a buzz cut and a jaw made of granite, reached into his windbreaker and pulled out a pair of stainless steel handcuffs. "Mr. Vance, we have enough on these synthetic revenue wire transfers alone to hold you for 72 hours. If you want to talk about the medical data theft, we can do that at the field office." Jared's knees buckled. He fell back into his chair, his head in his hands. "I just wanted to be someone, Silas. I just wanted to be at the top for once." "You were at the top, Jared." I leaned over the table until I could smell the stale bourbon on his breath. "You had a beautiful home. You had a wife who believed in you. You had a guest house full of 40 years of wisdom you could have asked for at any time. But you decided that being a founder was more important than being a man." I slid the surrender of assets document across the table. "Sign it. Sign over the equity, sign over the intellectual property, what little there is. Sign the confession of judgment for the Black Oak debt. If you sign now, Sarah gets the house back, clear of any liens. If you don't, I'll let the FBI walk you out of here in front of the neighbors, and I'll spend every penny of my Aegis dividend making sure you never see a beanbag chair again." Jared looked at Sarah. She was standing in the back of the room, her arms crossed, her face a mask of stone. She didn't offer a look of pity. She didn't offer a tear. She offered the silence of a woman who had finally seen the vapor for what it was. Jared picked up the pen, the expensive, gold-plated fountain pen he'd bought to celebrate his success. His hand was shaking so hard the nib scratched the paper. He signed his name 1, 2, 3 times. "It's done," he whispered, dropping the pen. It rolled off the table and fell into the pile of shredded paper on the floor. "Not quite," I said. I turned to the FBI agents. "He signed the civil restitution. The criminal side is yours, but I have one final request." "What's that, Silas?" the agent asked. "I'd like him to walk out the back way, through the redwoods. I want him to see the guest house one last time before the locks are changed." As the agents led shattered Jared out of the studio, I turned to the Aegis board. "Elena, start the asset recovery protocol. I want every cent of the laundered money traced. If there's a penny left in a Delaware shell company, I want it back in Sarah's trust by Monday." "On it, Chairman," she said, nodding to the team. The black Escalades pulled away 10 minutes later, leaving the Berkeley Hills in a profound, heavy silence. I stood in the center of my guest house, the content studio, and looked at the empty space where my life's work used to sit. Sarah walked over to me. She didn't hug me, she just put her hand on my shoulder. "What happens to the guest house now, Dad?" I looked at the industrial shredder sitting cold and silent in the corner. I looked at the pile of white confetti on the floor, the legacy Jared thought he'd destroyed. "We're going to buy some new filing cabinets, Sarah, and I'm going to teach you how to read a ledger properly, because the only way to keep the ghosts away is to make sure the books always balance." I checked my ThinkPad one last time. Notification: Black Oak debt settled. Title: cleared. Vanguard Nexa dissolved. "Type justice in the comments," I whispered, the weight of the Aegis finally lifting.
The Berkeley Hills don't forgive easily, but they do forget. 6 months after the liquidation event, the fog still rolls through the redwoods every morning, but it no longer feels like a shroud. It feels like a clean slate. I sat on the porch of the main house, watching the sunlight hit the copper roof of the guest house. It was no longer a vibe hub. The neon signs had been stripped and sold at a police auction, and the beanbag chairs had been replaced by the heavy smell of old wax mahogany of my original drafting table. Jared Vance's sentencing had been a quiet affair in a federal courtroom in San Francisco. Section 1343, wire fraud. Section 1028, aggravated identity theft. The judge didn't care about innovation or disruptive potential. She cared about the $2.1 million in synthetic revenue and the forged signature of a senior board member. Sentence: 48 months in federal prison. Restitution: total asset forfeiture. Jared's Porsche was gone. His Rolex was gone. Even the gold-plated fountain pen he'd used to sign his own downfall had been logged into a civil evidence locker. He was no longer a founder. He was an inmate number, learning the hard way that you can't A/B test your way out of a felony. Sarah walked out onto the porch, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She looked different now. The frayed look was gone, replaced by the sharp, focused energy of a woman who had spent the last 6 months as the court-appointed receiver for the Nexa remains. "The final audit is done, Dad," she said, sitting in the chair Jared used to claim was antiquated. "We recovered 80 cents on the dollar from the Delaware shells. The rest, well, let's just say the consulting fees Jared paid to himself were spent on things that don't hold their value." "And the house, Sarah?" "The title is clear," she said, a small, triumphant smile playing on her lips. "Aegis Holdings officially released the lien this morning. It's back in the Vane family trust, 100% equity." I took a sip of my coffee. It was strong, black, and honest. "What are you going to do with the studio?" I asked. "I'm keeping it, but not for podcasts. I've reached out to a few of the engineers Jared fired, the ones who actually knew how to code. We're going to build something that actually works, a real risk management API. No mirrors, just math."
I looked at her, and I saw my own reflection again. Not the tired ghost, but the man who knew how to build things that lasted. I have some old project files in the third cabinet from the '92 Petro-Global turnaround. There's a logic structure in there for high-velocity debt tracking that might give you a head start. I know, Dad, she laughed. I already found them. I didn't shred everything, you know. I stood up and walked down the steps toward the guest house. I didn't need a ThinkPad or a ghost net to feel the security of the property. I opened the heavy oak door. The room smelled of cedar and old paper. My filing cabinets were back, standing in a neat, disciplined row. I walked to the one labeled Vanguard Nexa, closed. I pulled out a single sheet of paper, the original eviction notice Jared had handed me over sourdough toast. I didn't burn it. I didn't shred it. I placed it in a clear plastic sleeve and filed it at the very front of the drawer. In engineering, we keep the failed parts. We keep the snapped bolts and the cracked beams, not out of malice, but as a reminder of what happens when the load exceeds the integrity. I sat at my drafting table and opened a fresh ledger. Entry number 1402. Property restored, debt settled, legacy integrity 100%. I looked out the window at the redwoods. The fog was lifting, revealing the solid, unshakable foundation of the hills. The audit is officially closed, I whispered to the quiet room. I closed the ledger and turned off the light. The click of the switch was the only disruption I needed for the rest of my life. If you like this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of this sphere.